Welcome back to Train Signal. You are watching the second part of the video for Lab 1, Network Setup of benandbrady.com. Let's review what we have done so far. I'm going to take you back to our network diagram over here. This is how I have set up my network. There are two switches. On the first switch is the computer called DC1 connected, and we have configured DC1 as 201.1, and I've installed the Active Directory on DC1. Now it is time to install Active Directory on DC2. DC2 will be the additional domain controller of benandbrady.com. So let's go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is minimize this screen and then go on to our next server, which is DC2. And let's see, here we go. I have a connection to that open. So here's DC2. Let's verify a few things. I'm going to go to the properties of DC2. Here is our network card. Going back to its TCP/IP properties, it is set up at 201.2. So I have set up DC2 as a computer in the first network, and my DNS is going to be 201.1. So just to make sure that the connections are okay, especially the DNS portion, folks. If the DNS is not set up correctly, believe it or not, a lot of things in a domain will simply stop working. And then before we actually go ahead and make this one the domain controller, let's make sure we have connectivity with DC1, because it's going to obtain the Active Directory domain database from DC1. So let's make sure we can ping DC1. So I'm going to go to the command prompt over here and type ping DC1, and let's see if we are successful. Here we go. So we have good connectivity between DC1 and DC2. We had verified this before, but it's a great idea to verify it before we start the DC promo process. I've already inserted the CD-ROM on the computer DC2. So in case it needs any files, not that it won't, it will actually need anything, but just in case if it does, it's available to it. So here we go. This time I'm going to use the first method of Active Directory installation, where it's going to ask us the questions and we'll answer it. So I'm going to type DC promo over here and click on OK. If you'd like additional practice in creating those answer files, I highly recommend, instead of doing it this way, what you can do is use the answer file that I created for DC1, namely dcinfo.txt, modify its content so that you can answer the questions for DC2. I'm going to click on the OK button over here, and it's going to start the Active Directory installation wizard. It's going to ask us questions. Let's start answering those questions. Operating system compatibility, it's informing us about backward compatibility with 95 and NT. I'm simply going to say next over there. What am I doing over here? A new domain controller for a new domain, or an additional domain controller for an existing domain? Well, that's what I will be. DC2 is going to be an additional domain controller for benandbrady.com. Click on the next button. This is the credentials of the user who has the authority to actually install an additional domain controller in the benandbrady.com domain. In our case, the username is administrator. The password that I had set up was password, and the domain is benandbrady.com. Here we go. And then click on the next button. It's going to verify that I have the right to do that, and it's asking me for the domain to select. So I would like to create an additional domain controller for this domain. I browsed it. Now the next thing is a critical step. If you do not have good connectivity, this is where the errors will be. When I click on the next button, it will attempt to contact the domain controller, the existing domain controller for benandbrady.com, and then try to copy the database from there. So I'm going to click on the next button, and there we go. It went pretty quick, so it actually picked up the domain and everything looks good. Once again, if you recall from our previous discussions, where do you want it to store? The Active Directory will be stored in the Windows directory. It will make a folder called NTDS. The log file will be in a folder called NTDS as well. Clicking on the next button, this is sysvolve, and this is important. It must be on an NTFS volume. And our partitions, by the way, when I installed server, I had created all of them as NTFS. The partitions were NTFS. So it's going to create a folder called sysvolve in the NTFS volume. Restore mode password. This is the password for directory services restore mode. We have decided that the password will be rainbow. So I'm typing that password over here. Click on the next button, and now it's ready to actually start the installation process. We'll click on the next button. If you notice, the graphic is a little bit different this time. What it is doing is it is simply not creating the Active Directory like you saw this graphic in the last video. It's actually copying the Active Directory from here and then writing it to here. So this is DC1. This is the symbol for DC1 or the existing domains, and you can see a little balloon that is going by to show you that data is actually being transferred from the pipeline over here from here, this is your network cable, there we go, here, and then it is being written to the second domain controller, which is this one. Okay, so at this point, DC1 is getting installed as the additional domain controller for the benandbrady.com. I'm going to pause the video over here. The moment it finishes, we will restart I'm going to restart DC2 and then join you, and then let's do our Active Directory once again to see the changes that have taken place. So I'm going to pause the video over here. Here we go. The Active Directory just finished installing. So now I need to click on the finish button over here, and it's asking me to restart the server. So let's go ahead and do that. Once again, we'll lose our connection to DC2 from our recording station over here. There we go, it's gone. And now DC2 will restart, and we have successfully installed the additional domain controller in a benandbrady.com domain. So going back over here, let's review what we've done so far. We have our first domain controller that actually created the root of the network and of the domain benandbrady.com. Then we have a second domain controller, and they both belong to the same subnet, which is the 200.200.201.0 subnet. Okay, so we have successfully installed these two. Now, logically speaking, what we need to now do is actually configure our server, which is eventually going to be a router, before we focus on DC3. And here's why. DC3 is set up with an IP address of 200.200.202.1. At this point, in fact, it cannot contact any of these servers on the first network, namely DC1 as well as DC2. So let's verify that. So I'm going to go over here and let's connect to DC3. In the meantime, DC2 is rebooting. Once it reboots, we will verify that DC2 has been correctly installed in the Active Directory as well. But in the while that happens, let's check for a few things over here. So I'm going to clear the screen, and let's first check the IP address on this, which is 202.1. So this is on the second subnet. Let's see if we can ping 200.200.201.1, which is our domain controller 1. And again, it says host unreachable. And there's a very good reason for this. One of the reasons is that I've not set up the default gateway. And I did that on purpose so that I build up this network slowly and make sure you understand each component of TCP/IP as I do so. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to minimize this. Let's say even if I do set up the the gateway. So I'm going to go over here and set up the gateway. Now, for this particular computer, let's go back to a network diagram. DC3's gateway is 202.254 because these two belong on the same side of the network. So I'm going to go back to DC3, and then the gateway for this should be 200.200.202.254, with which it has connectivity. We'll verify that as well. Click on the OK button over here, and I've set up the gateway. Let's verify now. I'm going to type ipconfig one more time. So the gateway is set up correctly. Let's ping the default gateway this time. So we know that we can reach the gateway 254, and yes, I can. So I can reach my router. Now let's try to ping 201.1 one more time. Once again, the router is not configured. You're able to reach the router, but the router is not routing the packet to subnet 1 on which DC1 resides. All right, so we need to first configure the router, because without doing that, I cannot install Active Directory on DC3, because in order to install Active Directory on DC3, the method that we are using, we need to contact DC1 so that the Active Directory can actually get transferred over the cable from DC1 to DC3. So it's very important that we set up router 3 first. I'm sorry, we set up the third server, which is going to be a router, and make sure we set it up as a router. So we're going to do that next. And in the meantime, the second server, which is DC2, is booting up. And once it finishes booting up, we will verify the presence of it in the Active Directory as well. So here I am. I'm on a computer called route. Actually, let's close this connection. I don't need to be on DC3 at all. Let's go to the router. So here we are on the router. This computer is going to be the router for our two networks. Now, I've already labeled this computer as router. Now, going back to the network places, if you recall, there were two NIC cards. Here's the first NIC card to network 2, and a second NIC card over here set up on network 1. Now, a little bit on the storyline for Ben and Brady Corporation. They have two locations. If you're familiar with our other other lab books, you will know that Ben and Brady basically has two locations. One is in California, the other is in is in North Carolina. What we will do is, California is the headquarters, so network 1 would be in California where DC1 resides. So here is my NIC card set up for network 1. Let's verify that. I'm going to go to the TCP IP properties of that, and yes, it is set for network 1. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to rename this connection and call it California. So I'm going to put the symbols for the state over here, California, and this particular one, I'm going to call it North Carolina. So those are our two locations. The next thing we will do is, we will join this server, which is at this point a workgroup computer, to the domain so that it becomes a member of the domain benandbrady.com and participates in all the security settings of this domain. So in order to join a computer to the domain, what we need to do is right click on the computer over here, which is the router, properties, and then go to the computer name tab over here, click on the change button, and then over here we're going to join the domain. So let's write down the name of the domain, which is Ben and Brady. Click on the OK button. It's trying to contact the domain and should soon ask us for the username and the password of the administrator of benandbrady.com. This is the person who has the authority to allow a workstation to join the domain. So I'm going to type over here the username administrator, and a password is going to be password. Click on the OK button. Should take a few minutes, and then we will see a message box that says that we have successfully joined the computer known as router to the domain of benandbrady.com. Typically over here, I prefer to type the words Ben and Brady. I've noticed that the net BIOS slips through much faster than benandbrady.com. Sometimes you will notice that when you type benandbrady.com, you get a message saying that it's unable to contact the domain and so forth. All you do is simply shut down and restart all the computers in a network, and the settings will be in effect one more time. So in a few minutes, it's going to join a domain. And once the domain, once this computer joins the domain, here we go. Welcome to benandbrady.com. So this is not a domain controller. It's simply a member server of the benandbrady.com domain. I'm going to click on the OK button. And again, this is a major change. So router is also going to restart. And we're going to lose a connection over here. Here we go. It's going to, other people are logged on. That is me. So that's okay. Break the connection. And we just lost our remote connection to the computer known as router. So let's verify if DC1 is up and running. So I'm going back to DC1. Okay, DC1 is up. Let's go to DC2. It was going to restart, and here we go. DC2 has successfully restarted, and let's see whether the values on DC2 reflect that it is now an additional domain controller for the benandbrady.com domain. So I'm going to double click on this. And in the meantime, the router is restarting. So we have a lot of things going for us at the same time. And the operations are going pretty efficient. I'm sure when you make sure that you have set up all the right IPs and the connectivity is okay, you will have smooth sailing just like the way we are having in this video. Here we go, it's trying to come up. Taking a little bit longer than I expected, but it should be coming up very soon. Here we go. Alrighty, so I'm on DC2. Let's rename this computer object over here so that it reflects DC2. So that way you are completely sure as to which computer you're looking at. Alright, so we are on DC2 now. Let's right click on, as you can see the operation is a little bit slower. Also keep in mind that once you make a major change such as installing Active Directory on a server, expect things to slow down a little bit in the beginning because services are still loading even though the computer has started up. I'm going to go to the computer name tab, and here we go. We are the additional domain controller of the benandbrady.com domain. And I can verify it from here or from DC1. Let's do it from here. Let's go to Active Directory, and then over here, let's go to Active Directory users and computers. If you recall, there was a container called domain controllers. And in the domain controllers container, there was just one domain controller named DC1. Now we should expect to find both DC1 as well as DC2 because now we have two domain controllers in our domain. Eventually you will see DC3 over here as well. What about a computer called router? Let's recall from our conversation, should you expect to find the computer account for the computer called router over here or somewhere else? Router is not a domain controller, it's a member server. It acts like a client to the domain. So the computer account for that should be in the computers container, and there we go. Okay, automatically when we joined the router to the network benandbrady.com, it created a computer account in the computers container. And lastly, always turn on the advanced features so you can see everything there is to see in our network. Now, even though there are two domain controllers, they share the same Active Directory, and that's the whole idea behind setting up sites and then making sure the replication takes place, okay? And we'll be doing that soon, okay? So let's exit out of this, and I'm going to show you all that as to how to replicate as well. So we are currently on DC2. I'm going to, let's minimize this connection at this point and see if if the router is up and running at this point. So the best way to verify that is by actually pinging it. I'm going to ping from my workstation over here too. So let's try and ping the router, whose IP address is 200.200.201.254. It has two NIC cards. This NIC card seems to be available. So I guess it is up and running. So let's connect to it. I'm going to connect to my router connection. Okay, it's making the connection now. And the router is now a member of the benandbrady.com network. Now, what we need to do is configure the routing service on this computer. So what we will do is configure this computer as a router. In order to do that, we need to configure the routing and remote access service on this computer and set it up as a private network router. And we will do that in a moment. So there we go. Router is up and running. And if I were to right click on this one and go to the properties of the router's computer object, you will see that it is no longer in the work group. In fact, it became a member of the domain benandbrady.com. So let's verify that. Here we go. It's also a member of the domain benandbrady.com. Okay, so the difference is you can change it over here and you can change it to any other domain if you want to, whereas on a domain controller, it's fixed to that particular domain. So seems to be working okay too. Great. Now, going back over here, let's set up a few other things before we actually set it up as a router. For DC1 and DC2, the default gateway or the router will be the interface 200.200.201.254. So let's go ahead and set that up also. I'm trying to do this systematically as much as I can just to show you the steps. We already did that on DC3 if you recall. We set up the default gateway over there. So what I'm going to do is in turn go to DC1 and let's go to the properties of DC1. And DC1's router is going to be 200.200.201.254. Click on the OK button over here. Okay, and it's done. For DC2, the router again is going to be the same interface, which is, let's go to the TCP IP properties, which is 200.200.201.254. Very good. Alrighty, I should have done that before, but we can do it right now. So let's go to the command prompt. And I'm on DC2. And now let's try to ping the router, which is just going to type the word router at this point. Here we go. And I was able to successfully reach my default gateway, which is 201.254. Let's go to DC1. These steps are extremely important. I cannot emphasize how important they are, because one little connectivity problem is all it takes to actually bring down a network. So here we go. I was able to reach the router from this one as well. So I'm going to minimize these screens now. Actually, I was on my workstation screen, and my workstation is connected to both networks just for convenience. Let's actually go to DC1 now, and then do the same thing, ping router, and I got a successful packet from 201.254. So great, we have connectivity. Close this box. Now let's go ahead and set up the router as a routing device. So far we've just called it a router. Now let's actually set up the service called routing and remote access. This is a service that is already installed by default. Unlike other services, routing and remote access is such a basic service in server that is installed by default. You don't actually have to go to the control panel and install it. There are very few services like that for which you don't actually have to go there. So here we go. routing remote access is already installed as a service, we need to configure it. As you can see, there's a red arrow pointing downwards because the router is not yet configured for routing and remote access. So what I'm going to do is select this, and now let's go ahead and configure the service known as routing and remote access. To do this, you need to right click on the router object over here, and then click on this link called configure and enable routing and remote access. Okay, so here's the wizard. Welcome to the routing and remote access server setup wizard. Once again, all we have to do is follow the directions in the wizard and we'll have it up and running. Now you can set up a server 2003 machine as a router for various purposes. You can set it up for remote access so that clients or your users from outside the office can actually dial up or VPN into the servers or into the network within the company. That's not what we want. The next thing you can do, this is for outgoing network address translation. You can have all the clients in your local area network access the internet by setting up your router as a NAT server. That's not what we want. This one again is VPN access and NAT both combined. What we want is a secure connection between two private networks. We have a private network in the California location whose network ID is 200.200.201.0, and we have another network in the North Carolina location whose IP address or whose network ID is 200.200.202.0. That's what we want. If you're not happy with any of these custom designed settings, you can click on custom configuration and do and pick and choose exactly the settings that you want. So in our case, this should suffice. This is what you select to create a router to route packets between two networks or two private networks. We'll click on the next button over here. Do you want demand dial connections? We're not going to have anybody dialing into this router, or this router will not dial to another routers for access, so I'm going to say no over here. And then that was it. In our case, we don't need to answer any more questions. I'm going to click on the finish button over here, and it's going to set up the service. Once the service is set up, what will happen is you should see a green arrow pointing upwards. The domain administrator must complete this task. Click on OK, which is fine. I'm going to click on the OK button over here, and the service will restart. Okay, and there we go. You have the green arrow pointing upwards, and your router has successfully been set up. The fact that you see a green arrow and pointing it upwards, that means that the router is set up. Well, we should still verify that the routing is actually taking place in our network. So how do we verify that? The first and the most important thing is make sure that all the computers have the default gateway set up correctly. In our case, we verified that. We went to DC1 and DC2 and make sure that the gateway is correct. And then we also went to DC3 and then verified that the gateway is set up correctly over there as well. So let's go through each of these computers. We are currently on our first on DC1, which is on the first network or the California network. So let's go to the command prompt of this particular computer. And over here, I'm going to once again ping my default gateway, which is router, and I should get a successful packet back. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to venture a little bit. What we're going to do is we're going to ping a computer on the other side of the network. In other words, from DC1, I'm going to ping DC3, which belongs to the other side. So let's see if we can do that. And if I'm successful in doing so, then I know that my router is working okay. So let's try that. I'm going to say ping, and over here I'm going to type the IP address of DC3, which is 202.1, and let's see what happens. Here we go. I was successfully able to ping DC3 from DC1. Okay, so that means my router seems to be working okay. Let's give it one more try. What I'm going to do is go to how about we go to DC3. So I'm going to go to DC3 over here. Let's open up a connection for DC3. Okay, now in the command prompt for DC3, which is already open, that's good, that's great. Actually, this is good. Remember before when I tried to ping DC1, I was unable to do so. Let's see if I can succeed this time in doing that. So I'm going to go down over here. And this time, actually it was already typed up for me. Let me just reposition this window a little bit so you can see it much more clearly. You know what, I'm going to clear the screen. Here we go. And let's ping 200.200.201.1. Successful. So our router is working great. At this point, we have done the following. I'm going to close the screen and take you back to our network setup. We have joined DC1 and DC2 are both domain controllers on the first network. DC3 is still a standalone server, but it's on the second network, and the router is now configured as a routing device, and it's routing packets between networks 1 and network 2. Alrighty? So before we actually set up DC3 as the additional domain controller, and we're going to follow the same steps that we did in DC2, so I'm going to go through it very quickly. And while that is happening, what we will do is we will go to Active Directory and see if actually things are looking okay over there. So now let's do the last thing over here, which is to set up DC3 as an additional domain controller for the benandbrady.com network. Once again, I hope you understand the key point that the router must be set up correctly and configured, because if the DC3 cannot contact DC1, it will be unable to actually get the Active Directory on it. So having done so, let's go to DC3 now. So here we are on DC3, and over here I'm going to run the DC promo process and install the Active Directory on it. So once again, we're going to follow the same steps that we did for DC2. Click on DC, type DC promo, click enter, and then next, domain controller as an additional domain controller for an existing domain, username administrator, password is password, okay, click on the next button. It's trying to contact the domain at this point. There we go. It was not able to contact, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to type benandbrady.com this time, and then click on the next button. There we go. And then pick it up. Here are the locations for the directory, the sys volume, the password for the directory services restored mode we decided was the word rainbow. I typed that, click on next, and now it's going to actually start installing Active Directory. So I'm going to minimize the screen, and let's go to DC1 and have a look at actually what has taken place so far. Oops, let's go back to DC1, and I'm going to actually close the command prompt screen. We know we have good connectivity at this point. I don't need to ping any other computers. Let's go to admin tools and then go to Active Directory users and computers. Very soon we should see a new object in the domain controllers link out here. Like, as you can see, there are only 2 of them. So DC3 is still trying to join over here, which will be the third domain controller for our domain. And here's our computers at this point. DC3 is trying to join. This is an interim process. It is trying to join the Active Directory, and it has made it a client, and then eventually it will move from here to over here. Okay, and you will see that very soon. What else do we need to verify over here? I'm going to close this, and let's go to DNS, and let's see the results so far. So I'm going to go to Active Directory, admin tools, and then go to DNS, and we should be able to find all the computers in our benandbrady.com domain listed out here. Here we go. Router, 2 IPs, they're both listed with the same DNS server. DC1, DC2, DC3 will soon be listed as well. Okay, so things are working good, looking good so far, and the lab setup was pretty elaborate. After all, we are setting up network for 2 different locations, and then we are also setting up a router to route packets between the 2. So most of our videos, the lab setup is not elaborate. Over here, the lab setup is part of the video itself, a major part of the video, because if the network locations are not set up correctly, Active Directory will not replicate over the 2 locations. So I'm going to wait for DC3 to finish the process, and as soon as it is done, I'm going to join you one more time. I'm going to restart DC3, and then once DC3 restarts, then we have to perform a key task. What we will do is we'll create an object in the Active Directory and then replicate the object. Once the object is replicated, all 3 domain controllers should actually display that object in its own Active Directory. So that will be a key step. I'm going to pause the video over here. I'm going to let DC3 finish the Active Directory installation, restart, and then we'll take it from there. Welcome back. DC3 just restarted, and now it's time to verify whether our network is set up okay. We are done with our network setup finally. We have 2 locations and a router that connects to 2 locations. So just let's go ahead and verify and make sure that the domain replicates okay at this point. So I'm going to go to DC1. So I am on our first domain controller, and let's first verify a few things. I have this link open over here called Active Directory Users and Computers. So let's minimize this one, maximize this I mean, and let's go to the domain controllers link. Remember, DC3 was not listed before, it is listed now. In the interim period you saw it listed as DC3 because it was still making it a domain controller. It's out of the computer's container at this point. So domain controllers, all three domain controllers listed, our router is listed right over here, and our domain looks good at this point. Now what I'm going to do is take you to a tour of a link called Active Directory Sites and Services. So I have just started Active Directory Sites and Services. This is another tool in the administrative tools link, and we'll be spending a considerable amount of time in the videos to come in this particular tool. But to begin with, we have our first site or the first geographical location, and if you recall, when we set up DC1, we called our first site default-first-site. In this there is a link called servers, and at this point we have 3 domain controllers in our network. The Active Directory Sites and Services only shows the domain controllers, and it shows the replication topology and the replication process between these 3 domain controllers. So if you recall, Active Directory is a shared hierarchical database. The Active Directory of benbrady.com is being shared by all 3 domain controllers, DC1, DC2 and DC3, meaning that I can walk up to any of these domain controllers or connect to any one of them, for example DC2, create a user, and expect to find that user account on DC1 as well as on DC3. This is the process of replication. It takes place automatically within 15 minutes. However, if you want, you can push it yourself. So just to show you how this replication works, what you have to do is expand the servers link and then find your domain controllers there. And then as you expand each domain controller, you will see a setting called NTDS settings. You click on that, and on the right hand side you will see 2 connection objects or 1 connection object depending on how the replication topology works. For example, DC2 will have only 1 connection object. And what you do is you select that object, right click on it, and then say replicate now. What you've done is, remember we were on the NTDS settings for DC1, and here is what it says from server DC3. So what we've done is replicated from DC3 to DC1 and so forth. You do not have to do this, but after you set up multiple domain controllers, ensure that you go over there and click on replicate now button. And if you see this message that says Active Directory has replicated the connections, what this means is that your domains are in sync, rather your domain controllers are in sync. All domain controllers are talking to each other. Let's try it one more time. Replicate now. Your domain controllers are talking to each other, and no matter which domain controller you go to and create a new Active Directory object, that object will show up on all the domain controllers in your domain. So let's verify that as well. So not to take it from on its face value, what we will do is we will go back to Active Directory Users and Computers, and over here in the users link over here, create a new user. I'm going to call this new user, we'll reposition this window. Let's create a user called, and let's call it test. So here's a user that I'm going to create. I'm going to call it test. And remember, I'm creating this on DC1. Click on the next button. Here, create a password. My password is going to be with a capital P. I'm going to type capital P, password number 1. Once again, the password is the word password with a capital P. And I've put a number 1 at the end over here just so that I follow the password policy that is set up for the benbrady.com domain. I'm going to uncheck this box that says user must change password. Click on next. Oops, I had made a mistake. Let's type it again. Okay, hopefully I typed both of them identically this time, and I just created a user object on DC1. Now, if you're lucky, you know how things are when you don't want certain things to happen, they always happen. Let's go to DC2, and let's see if the user test has already shown up over here. If so, then the domains have already replicated. If not, we will actually push it ourselves. So I think we are in luck. I don't see it over here, but let's just verify that. I'm going to go down the list, and I don't have the user object called test. So what we're going to do is we're going to replicate our domain. I'm going to go back to DC1 because I had the tool running over there. I could have done this from DC2 as well. But going back to Active Directory sites and services, I'm going to right click on this and say replicate now. Just replicate a few times, just make sure I get all the domain controllers here, and that should do it. Okay, so I've replicated for DC1, DC2 and DC3. I could have gone here and done it also, but it's not necessary at this point. Now let's verify whether replication actually took place. I'm going to go back to DC2. So I went to DC1, replicated, I'm back to DC2. Go back over here. I'm just going to refresh my screen by clicking on F5 button over here and see if the user object actually showed up. Okay, let's do it one more time. And let's see if the user object called test actually showed up in our network. So far I cannot see it, but let's go down the list. There we go. Okay, so our domain replicated. Even though we created this user object on DC1, it actually showed up on DC2. Last but not the least, we will go to DC3 and verify the same. So here's DC3, and I'm going to go to admin tools, Active Directory users and computers, and see if the user object test showed up over here as well. There we go. Okay, so our domains are in sync, our domain controllers are in sync, Active Directory has successfully been installed on 3 computers, and the network looks good so far. Alrighty, to summarize, let's go back one screen up. This is the network we set up. All of them are set up correctly at this point, and this is what has happened so far. We have 2 networks. In the network ID of 200.200.201.0, we have 2 computers, DC1, DC2. These are the first and the additional domain controllers of the benandbrady.com domain. Then on the second network, whose ID is 200.200.202.0, we have just 1 computer, namely DC3, which is the additional domain controller of the benandbrady.com domain. And finally, we have a 4th server called a router, has 2 network cards. One network card is connected to the 201 network, the other network card is connected to the 202 network, and it is set up as a router for the 2 sites, namely California and North Carolina. I use the word sites just loosely over here because we actually labeled those 2 connections CA and NC. We'll actually be setting up these sites in the videos to come. So at this point, we have successfully finished our video for the lab setup. This was the second portion. In the first portion of the video, I showed you how to set up unattended the Active Directory installation on the domain controller DC1. And then in the second video, we set up additional domain controllers, DC2 and DC3. We set up the router, and we set up the service known as routing and remote access, and we are successfully able to now transfer packets between any of the computers in our network. In fact, we were able to replicate a domain through the router between the 2 sites, namely California and North Carolina. This brings us to an end to this video. I thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you very soon in a different video in Active Directory.